Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last webinar of 2020, the top 3 areas to invest in to reach the SDGs by 2030. I know it's a bit of a clickbait title, but we really mean it. So we are here with your host, Samuel Baumgartner, our enthusiastic impact investing pro, and of course, one of our returning guests, Paul Hailey, our head of impact. He's also the instigator of our annual impact report, which you can download on the side of the screen in the handout section. It was just published, and it is indeed about Generation 2030 and what to do to reach the SDGs by then. So very poignant for this webinar. All right, everyone is muted. So if you have a question, just type it into the chat function on the side of the screen, and we will answer it at the end of the webinar. And then finally, a little bit about responsAbility. We are pioneers of impact or sustainable investing. We invest in 3 investment themes. So climate finance, which includes commercial and industrial solar and green lending and many, many other things. Also sustainable food and agriculture across the entire agricultural value chain. And finally, financial inclusion from microfinance to fintech. So I will hand over now to Paul and Samuel and jump back in at the end for questions. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much for the intro, Stacy. A warm welcome to the audience. I just went through the guest list quickly. We have quite the turnout again from all across the world. So good morning and good afternoon to everybody where appropriate. Before we get started, we would like to ask you a question to get to know you. We have a poll question for you that's going to pop up in a moment. This will give us a chance to see where you're standing a bit and get an idea of who's tuned in. Which trends in emerging markets will change the world most significantly? This is a topic that we will go in a bit more detail, but we first obviously want to know what your point is and get some insight on that. I know you, Paul, have strong feelings on this topic.
Yes, well, usually I cop out and say, well, all of them are important, but I think I would obviously climate change is a critical element for me, but I would say a lot of the other drivers are really quite key in a lot of different respects. But we can discuss that more in a moment, I guess. I wouldn't want to skew the vote.
Definitely.
A few more seconds, and then I'll close the poll. Just a few more seconds.
Sounds good. Very good. I think it's also interesting to see some of the topics that have popped up, and there you go. If you had to put money on it, you were on the right one with climate change, Paul. I think this is a reflection that our audience, representative of a global audience, definitely puts climate change way up there. But it's also interesting to see that we have topics like demographics and technology that are definitely on the agenda, politics and culture. It's good to see that these topics are not forgotten because of all the climate change discussions that are going around now.
No, absolutely, I think so, and I think this will be something that we'll seek to expand on quite a lot over the course of the webinar.
Perfect. So we have 10 years to go until we should be or need to be or have to be reaching the 17 Sustainable Development Goals set up by the UN. In our latest impact publication, we have gone about to identify 3 macro topics that are crucial for us to reach these goals by 2030. Maybe to start off, could you give us a bit of an overview, a quick one, of what these topics are?
Sure. Well, look, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time to come and join us today. Look, I think the last 12 months have made a lot of fools of people who came out with predictions. I think certainly if you looked at the series of predictions, perhaps 1 year ago, it would look a little different than right now. But at the same time, I think from our perspective, in terms of the long-term trends, in terms of what's needed to reach 2030, we've really zoomed in on 3 that we think are particularly important, and which for us especially showcase the fact that the 2020s are really going to be the decade for developing markets to really step to the fore and seize control of the discourse. The first one of these that we'd like to look at would be, of course, the topic of technology. It's an easy one to pick out. But I think one of the big changes that you will see is that over the next decade, you will see hundreds of millions of people come online for the very first time. And this is going to have a raft of different impacts, not least for the fact that there will be a lot of business models that were previously perhaps struggling a bit in the developing market context, but which will now become more tenable. And where perhaps those business models were especially struggling in some of the more remote rural areas where poverty levels are especially high. The second thing that we would like to focus on to a certain extent would be the question of, well, would be the fact that there are going to be some demographic changes that lead to some very significant economic and social changes, as you see a surge in working age populations in many developing countries, even as populations in the West start to age and decline. Now, we are going to need to create jobs for all of these young people hitting the workforce. And that includes, by the way, an unprecedentedly high number of educated young women hitting the workforce for the very first time in countries where the share of female employment has historically been quite low. And finally, I think the thing that we would like to point to, of course, is the ongoing shift towards, well, global urbanization, effectively. The fact that we are going to see the ongoing effects of urbanization, and this will present a series of challenges around the fact that how do we create sustainable cities, and how do we sustainably feed these cities? And all of this, as we mentioned before, and as the poll pointed to, is going to take effect, is going to happen against the backdrop of climate change and our success or failure in tackling it.
I see technology on the top of the list, and it's an interesting one because both you and I grew up with tech being this magic transformational force that's going to change the world and you know, make life better and solve all the problems and everything. Now, you and I have been around for more than 1 decade. How is this tech now going to be different for the next 10 years than from the previous 10 years?
Well, first of all, thank you for including me in the same generation as you. That's already a significant improvement for me.
We're not going to go into an age discussion.
More than 1 decade. Yeah, I mean, it's true that, look, technology has been the future for the last 30 or 40 years, right? But it's, you know, I think it's reasonable to say that, you know, what has changed, what is different? Technology is always a factor. Where, you know, how is this having an impact, and why? What has it got to do with developing markets? And for example, if you look back to 2017, when the World Bank surveyed the global population to find out who did not have a bank account even, nonetheless, of the 1.7 billion adults that didn't have a bank account back in 2017, we knew that 85% of them still had a mobile phone, or at least access to one. So we've known that technology provides a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential. The big change is this question around connectivity. The big change is going to be the fact that you are going to have a real surge in the number of people who will have access to the internet. Now, to put, and you know, and the changes that implies, to put that into a little bit of context and to provide a little bit more detail, let's take the example of India. Now, in India recently reached a milestone. This year, it announced that for the first time, it had 500 million active internet users. Now, that's already a pretty important milestone. It makes India the second highest internet user in the world. What was interesting was that more than half of those users, for the first time this year as well, came from rural areas. Or to put it in another context, or in another way, the villages of India have almost as many active internet users as the Eurozone. So I think this really illustrates the major change that you're going to start to see in this respect. And it's also worth pointing out that if you, especially in rural India, of course, virtually all of those people who are accessing the internet are doing so via mobile devices. The famous leapfrogging concept. And this isn't just an Indian phenomenon as well. If you take Nigeria, another country where population is surging and which is you know, increasingly critical for the region overall, in Nigeria, 40%, there was a 40% increase in the share of the population covered by 3G just in 2019. So this really is a pretty heavy game changer in terms of if you look at what 3G can provide and what it allows businesses to provide, and the fact that it allows businesses to provide products and services online via their own website in their own way, in a way that 2G and other business models simply didn't. And we've actually seen this mirrored in our portfolio. So if you look at the microfinance institutions in our portfolio, many, if not most of them, have launched mobile products only in the last 2 to 3 years. And that is directly due to the impact of connectivity, of 3G coming into play.
So obviously also pricing,
yes,
and the pricing and the democratization process of technology plays a key role in this macro topic as well, no?
Absolutely, yes. And this, as we said before, the problem was, if you look at M-Pesa and other business models relating to mobile payments, doing payments via text messages, they're great, but they rely on a very specific set of circumstances. And they're business models that are ultimately highly dependent on and to even dominated by mobile phone providers. With 3G, pretty much any business that can set up a website and set up and provide kind of online payments is going to be in place to benefit from clients, throughout their country, throughout their region even. So this really is, as you say, it's the democratization of technology throughout all segments of the populations in the developing world.
Okay, so obviously with technology being one of the main drivers, it's all good, to be talking about connectivity. But how is this going to change the power dynamic now? Also shifting a bit on the emerging market focus, how is this going to change the power dynamic between the developed and the developing world? Having taken a look as tech as a driver for also creating new opportunities. You mentioned you're now able to generate websites, payment transactions through the capabilities of 3G. So what are the areas that need investment to create these opportunities? And now also moving a bit into the second topic, the macro topic of generating opportunities. If you could highlight these as well, please.
Sure. Well, look, I think it goes without saying that this surge in connections isn't just over the long term, isn't just due to it's not just due to an improvement in infrastructure. And this is where I think where we start moving from, okay, now we have more consumers, towards the idea of developing markets being really taking control and being at the center of what is going on. Because this surge in people connecting is also due to a major shift from a demographic perspective. Now, we know that, for example, the global population is set to increase from 7.7 billion now to 8.5 billion by the end of the decade. 97% of this net increase in population is going to come in developing markets. Now, and it's worth pointing out that a lot of this growth, by the way, the fact that you've seen a surge in population growth is partly due to some of the successes of development. It's due to improvements in public health around things like infant mortality, around maternal mortality, around drastically reducing rates of communicable diseases, increasing rates of vaccination. So all of this has led to the point where you are now going to see a surge in working age populations, as we mentioned before. Now, we've already seen this. This has already taken place in China, and to their considerable economic benefit, it has to be said. It's already taken effect to a certain extent in India, and you are going to see this. You're going to see this continue and continue and climb, especially in sub-Saharan Africa over the course of the next 20 to 30 years, in fact. So what this effectively means is there will be that famous demographic dividend. There will be a surge in young people hitting the workforce, which means that we will need.
Sorry to interrupt you. And of that young group, there's also a large portion of women that are coming in that I think is also not to be underestimated from the component. First of all, there's a lot of women coming in, or a bigger number of women coming in for the first time, and that's also a huge market opportunity that we need to be ready for.
No, that's absolutely correct. So if we look at we will need to create around 400 to 500 million jobs between now and 2030. And as you said before, there is an unprecedentedly high share of women hitting the workforce as part of that in countries where, as we said before, historically women's employment has not necessarily been that high, at least in the formal economy. So And again, this is the result of another success in the area of development, which is to say that there has been a sharp reduction in the gender gap when it comes to enrollment at primary and secondary education. And now we've reached the point where we actually have more women enrolled in higher education than men. But as we said before, as with men, but I think specifically in the case of women in the developing world, well, especially in the case of women in the developing world, this requires us to make jobs, and it requires us to enable those to support and enable companies that are willing to give women those opportunities in those economies. Ultimately, though, logically, what we should be seeing, and my apologies to anyone who's heard me say this on other webinars and in other contexts, but I'll say it until I'm blue in the face. Women in the developing world represent one of the major trends and one of the major shifts in power over the 2020s. It is really going to be absolutely key. Logically speaking, we should really see a surge in women in the developing world as, first of all, as employees, then as consumers, and then eventually, of course, as managers and leaders. Now, we will need to provide support for those businesses that support women. And by the way, this will especially be in the area of small businesses, which are historically quite constrained from access to credit, which allows them to grow, but which according to the World Bank, provide around 3/4 of new job creation in emerging markets. But will also mean that we have to be a little bit innovative as well. One other change that we've started to see has been the rise in so-called gender lens investing products. So you've actually started to see investors starting to actively target companies that do more in this area. And this is just as true for our area as well. Gender lens investing, when it comes to investing in the developing world, is also another area that is rapidly on the rise, because people see the opportunity, but they also see the need in terms of reaching the SDGs to specifically and especially target business models that enable women in the developing world.
Before moving to the third topic, when looking at these first two macro topic, technology and creating opportunities, throughout now also the webinar, we hear a lot more people in the workforce, more consumption, more access, etc., etc. I think the third topic looks at mastering sustainability, because obviously these are all great components. However, we also need to do them in a way that this is going to go forward in a sustainable way, and we're not going to stress our planet and our resources even more than we have. On contrary, that we find ways to do this in a less stressful way. So to come to that point, could you then also give us some insights on what that means from a mastering sustainability perspective? How is this going to all fit together in the end?
I mean, it's an extremely good question. The big challenge of the next decade is, on the one hand, we have, as we know, all of the development challenges that are outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals, all of the topics that we need to address. And we know that growth is a part of that. Growing economies, growing populations, as we said before, growing workforces are a logical consequence of the fact that we have improved healthcare and we've improved education. There's still a long way to go, but growing populations are a consequence of that. And to a certain extent, growing economies are also a consequence of that as well, or a means to continue that trend. On the other hand, we have to grow sustainably. We have to grow in a way that is in line with resources, and we have to grow in a way that limits the ongoing rising greenhouse gas emissions. So all of this needs to be balanced up somehow. And in many respects, it's very unfair. We're effectively asking developing countries to do what the developed world so spectacularly failed to do, which is to say, grow in a way that is sustainable. So yes, this is, I think, nicely outlined by the fact that by the challenges when we talk about the need for sustainable cities, for example. The shift towards urbanization is really going to be a testing point for how we do sustainable development, basically. And again, the trends behind this are colossal, and they're also, to a certain extent, inevitable. Back in 2008, we reached the point in the developed world, or at least I think globally even, I think in the developed world, where there were more people in cities than in the countryside. Now, this is a point that we've recently passed, I think a year ago, in developing countries, but it's accelerating rapidly. So looking a little bit further forward, so to 2050, 2/3 of the population in developing countries will be in urban areas, and this will inevitably lead to a rise in so-called mega cities. And this is An example of this is the fact that by 2027, Delhi will have overtaken Tokyo as the world's most populous city. So we really need to find a way to create sustainabilities, create sustainable cities, and create an environment an urban environment that doesn't destroy quality of life, and doesn't supercharge climate change. And of course, then the answer to that is, well, look, how? How don't the two things sound contradictory? And I would actually disagree there. I think this is a tremendous opportunity in many respects. Bear in mind that much of, if not even the majority of the housing stock, for example, that needs to be built between now and 2030 to accommodate, literally in fact, this change, hasn't actually been built yet. So there is a lot of scope for us still to build sustainable, affordable housing in many cities. We will also need to create the infrastructure around that as well. We will need to find a way to create sustainable, accessible mortgages for low-income households in developing countries. We will also need to find a way to combat what will inevitably be some sort of rise in temperatures and increasing frequency of extreme heat events. So this will mean things even as mundane as sustainable and energy efficient air conditioning, to pick one example. We will need to find a way to limit urban pollution. So that means popularizing technology that is already available for more energy efficient, low polluting transportation methods. And then, of course, we need to feed all of these people. We know that agriculture is responsible for anywhere between 25 to 33% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We need to find a way to deal with this increase in populations while not seeing a massive rise in this greenhouse gas emissions as a result, which means we have to promote climate smart approaches to agriculture. So all of this sounds like a huge long wish list, but the good news is that the technology is there. And we know this. I mean, within our own company, we invest in a lot of these solutions and we do provide them. What is needed is the willpower and the investment behind this to support all of these methods, because this is a huge opportunity. The 2020s represent a huge opportunity, and the developing world is going to be at the center of all of these shifts.
And I think you wrap it up nicely. This is a huge opportunity. Obviously, all challenges are difficult to master. However, they also pose opportunities, and I think that's exactly where it comes in. We should look this as a chance, as an opportunity to go forward. And with that, we would also like to know from the audience in our next poll question, which of the three topics discussed today are the most relevant for you? So Paul and I obviously have very strong feelings. I specifically have. Maybe Paul, you can comment on your strong feelings to which is the most relevant topic. And no, you don't get to say all three of them because I know you were going to do that. If you'd have to pick one, maybe you can share that with us for while the participants are giving their opinion.
It's a very good question. I will put it this way. I find the topic of mastering sustainability interesting because it encompasses a lot of things, and because I like the idea of this duality, this challenge of, look, we inevitably have this rise in urbanization. It's what's happened in the developed world. It will happen in the developing world. We have to find a way to somehow manage that and to try and create urban environments that are sustainable and where quality of life is actually decent. And beyond that, to think about, well, how can we build them in such a way that we limit the impact on climate change?
Yep, there you go.
There you go.
Most of the audience agree, and I think I can only add to that. I think the importance of mastering sustainability is also, creating opportunity and connectivity and technology are all nice and well, but like we said earlier on, it's all about more, and that more we need to put it in line to do that in a sustainable way, that we don't continue damaging our environment and where we're living. So I think also the feedback that we get from the audience here, that mastering sustainability is a key topic, I think is a nice representation of that concept. So from our part, before we wrap it up, now that you've told us what is also important to you, that's also up to you to start to get engaged. So we've seen which topic is most important for you, and in order to do that, it's now also your task to go out and find a way to contribute to that, because in the end, to reach these goals by 2030, which we still have or only have 10 years left, we can only do it together. So it's up to each one of us. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for participating and also open the door for questions you should have during the webinar.
So to kick off the questions, we've got one here, Paul. To what extent do you think that the events of COVID-19 will interrupt these trends?
It's a very good question. Well, look, COVID, we hope, is going to, the impact of COVID should be short to medium term. And I'm thinking here about the economic effects, obviously. Nonetheless, if we look at some of the solutions that we mentioned here, for example, the important role that small businesses will play in job creation in the developing world, the unfortunate reality is that small businesses, in part due to the fact that they have less of a safety net, often less access to finance, they will have been hit especially hard by the impacts of COVID and the lockdowns that have occurred globally. So this will have had an impact, and it will have limited their ability to create jobs, at least in the next couple of years. On the other hand, there have maybe COVID will have perhaps accelerated one or two of these trends as well. So if we look, for example, there are a lot of countries where I think the shift towards more kind of online models, using 3G technology and everything else, probably will have been accelerated by the impact of COVID in some areas. So I think that will be it overall. Nonetheless, it's worth pointing out that many of the trends we're talking about, they are of a scale and of a scope that are so huge that COVID at best, at most, all COVID is going to do is slow them down, frankly.
Super. Next question we have, can the SDGs really still be achieved by 2030 realistically? So kind of in the same vein of this slowdown with COVID.
Well, I try to be a glass half full kind of person, obviously. But I think there is a reality that, especially with the impact of COVID, there are going to be areas where we're going to fail to achieve these. I think some of what where we're going to struggle to achieve them, at least without some kind of dramatic change over the next 10 years. You never know, for example, some of the opportunities provided by technology in this regard. But there are going to be probably certain areas where we will struggle. Some of the goals laid out in the SDGs are very broad ranging, are very significant. Nonetheless, I think we've made a tremendous amount of progress. It's just that in some cases that progress has been uneven. In some countries, they are already achieving them. They've got there, they've done very well. But there are other countries where, frankly, this hasn't been the case. And it's up to us to try and really focus, I think, on those countries that are lagging and do our best to improve it.
Super. Next question I have here. She says, I am curious to hear how important you think the rise of e-commerce is in the context of the SDGs. How do you think about this in the context of mastering sustainability?
Well, it's another very good question. We spoke before about how it would enable certain business models that were previously struggling to reach other areas. And I think obviously I would perhaps be more thinking about things like, can microfinance reach more remote rural areas? Can it do more? But I think e-commerce is still an area, obviously, that can, in many cases, boost economic growth, hopefully not at the expense of more local businesses, and can ultimately still provide a lot of benefits in that respect. For good or for bad, though, I mean, we all know with Amazon, there is the risk, for example, with a company like Amazon that also has quite a significant negative environmental footprint as well. So my very cagey diplomatic response is it honestly depends how it's done, frankly. But I would hope that all things being equal, it's an opportunity for us to boost economic growth further.
Perfect. And in the same vein, then. Next question, if I can see it, here we go. Is it more important then to invest in people or to invest in climate-friendly initiatives?
I think it's possible to achieve both of them. And again, I'm going to sound like I'm hedging my bets all the time here, but I think ultimately, let's be honest here, climate is something that is man-made. It is, there's no getting around this. This isn't something that was, this isn't something that is, no matter what the conspiracy theorists will tell you, this is something that we have brought about. So any climate solutions that we put in place have to incorporate the human factor. We have to be trying to think of solutions. And we've seen that to a certain extent in what we do, in some of the green lending programs that we do. What we're trying to do here is not necessarily some big top-down initiative, because that's not what we're there for. And governments do that, and they do it very well, and they achieve a lot as a result. But the climate solutions that we're promoting are typically on a more granular bottom-up basis. It's trying to help small businesses make that small shift, which if you do it enough times can actually translate into something that's quite significant. So overall, I would say that it's possible to do all of these things. But as we said before, there is still the balancing act. We need to find ways to allow people to achieve a certain quality of life, a certain degree of income, while doing so in a sustainable fashion that reduces emissions. And hopefully some of the ideas that we set out here will provide examples of those.
All right, and then I'll take one more question, Paul. He asked, Paul, what drivers are slowing down the investments on sustainable infrastructure projects?
Well, of course, typically, if you look at sustainable infrastructure, I'd say there's a couple of issues. First of all is developing countries can, on average, show a greater degree of regulatory uncertainty, although I think the last, 4 years of Trump, for example, have shown that that's not necessary. That's not just a monopoly that the developing world has, sadly. I would say that also you have the element of the fact that, look, these are long-term investments. They're long-term investments in markets that also otherwise can struggle to raise money locally as well via domestic markets. So it requires a certain risk appetite. It requires innovative structures that are able to support them. And as I said, it also requires, in the case of, for example, on-grid energy infrastructure, it requires governments that are willing to cooperate and provide a stable partner as well. But if you can, one thing I would say is that the SDGs explicitly set out the need for governments to have a renewable energy plan and to have an approach that is clear and consistent. And I think by and large, most governments do have that now, and they are in place. And I think most governments are aware of the fact that if you want to boost your infrastructure, you need to provide that stability. So I'm still optimistic that this is an area that's going to continue to grow over the next few years, because we need it to.
All right, thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll wrap it up there. Please don't forget to download the impact report, follow us on LinkedIn, and we'll kick off with new webinars next year in 2021. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.